We all have routines. I'm Jabron, and with diabetes, mine was finger sticks. Sometimes I skip them because it hurt. The Freestyle Libre 3CGM changed that. It gives me glucose insights without finger sticks. Learn more at freestylelibre.us.
Finger sticks are required if your glucose alarms or readings do not match symptoms, or when you see check blood glucose symbol for the first 12 hours. The views expressed should not be used for medical diagnosis or treatment as a substitute for professional medical advice. Individual circumstances may vary. For prescription only. Safety info found at freestylelibre.us.
Welcome to the Drafting the Past podcast. I'm Kate Carpenter, and in each episode, I interview a historian about how they research and write history. Today's guest thought her first biography might take her 3.5 years to write. It took 20, and at times she told me she was afraid she might not finish. What a gift to all of us that she did, and has gone on to write 3 additional books. I was thrilled to be joined for this episode by Megan Marshall.
Thank you, Kate. I'm really excited for this particular podcast at this particular time because history is under assault and we have to do our best to keep getting the stories out.
Megan is a writer and biographer who got her start writing book reviews. Her first biography was The Peabody Sisters, 3 women who ignited American Romanticism. It was awarded multiple prizes and became a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography and Memoir. Her second book, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, won the Pulitzer Prize in Biography. And her third book was Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, a biography of the poet Bishop, interwoven with chapters from Megan's own life leading up to her study with Bishop. She has also been awarded the Bio Award, the highest honor given by the Biographers International Organization. She has also won many other honors that I won't list here, but suffice to say, those 20 years were well worth it. This year, she published a book of essays called After Lives on biography and the mysteries of the human heart. It includes pieces on her family's history, her own encounters with historic events, and some further investigations into research that didn't make it into the other books. Our conversation was such a pleasure, and you'll hear from Megan about how she approaches the subjects and structures of her book and what has kept her going, plus why she believes biography is essential now. Enjoy my conversation with Megan Marshall.
You know, I didn't necessarily start out to be a biographer, although looking way back when I was a child, my grandmother was the children's librarian in Pasadena, where I grew up in the main library, and I spent a lot of time there with her, and I loved children's biographies, particularly of women, Amelia Earhart and Marie Curie. And I loved reading, novels about brainy little girls as well. The children's biographies were about brainy little girls or adventurous ones who grew up and did something. And then there were the, Little Women and Little House books. And I love books also that made me cry because, something moving took place towards the end. And I always thought, I did want to become a writer. I thought it'd be the greatest thing possible to move somebody else to tears by reading something I had written. So it seemed like that was something to aim for, but I had no idea how to do that. And I had skipped a grade in school, so I was always kind of a little behind. And if we were doing writing things, mine was never the one put up on the board. And I never made it into the poetry club in high school. But by the time I was in college, I took some time off and came back as a transfer student to Harvard, where I was lucky to get into some poetry writing classes. And suddenly poetry became the thing I thought I would do, particularly because I was always writing papers for classes and it got, these long, long things, and poetry seemed wonderfully short. But at the same time, I was an English major. We were studying American literature for the most part. That was my interest. And it was in the era still of new criticism where you didn't talk about the authors at all. But I found myself kind of secretly reading biographies of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman and that sort of thing, just wanting to know what the lives of these writers was like. So I had that interest in their lives and letters that was kind of a subversive one. And then I was taking classes, poetry writing classes with some eminent writers, Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop, and kind of getting glimpses into their lives. So when I left college at a time when there were few jobs in academe, I thought, I'm not going to try that. And I began working as a freelance writer, writing book reviews. The thing I most enjoyed was, looking, kind of analyzing books. How did they work? And I was writing some reviews for the New Republic of American history and biography. And then I wrote a first book that was about women today, single women who I considered the pioneers of feminism and the sexual revolution and, entering the professions. This was in the early 80s. And I thought this was going to, make a big splash because this was news to everyone. What were these women really doing? And in the end, I think the book came out too soon. It was, misunderstood by a lot of people. And I thought, I'm going to just leave this women today thing behind and go back to my interest in how people grew up to do whatever it was they did. I thought, I was interested in, at that time, not just one woman, but a group of women. How did they make the different choices that they did? And that led me to the Peabody sisters, my first biography, which, I had not done any kind of research in archives before. I was teaching myself on the job, and I was lucky to be based near the Massachusetts Historical Society, where there were very generous archivists as well as fellow scholars working on papers there. So, I was launched into this whole world of reading zillions of handwritten letters, and often they were from the 19th century that were in sometimes difficult handwriting and cross writing where they'd write across, one page. Anyway, I just fell in love with that process. And it took me a long time to finish that book, but I had found what I really wanted to do that brought together, the brainy girls growing up to do something, the American literature, the biography that interested me, and the kind of close reading that I had learned both in, as an English major and in these poetry workshops where, every word had to matter. So it all kind of came together, and I felt very good about what I was doing, but it was taking a very long time. I was raising kids. I used to give a talk called Writing in Waiting Rooms because that was so much what I was doing. I would, write when the kids were in school, but a lot of the time they weren't in school. They were going to the doctor, or they're having the physical therapy or whatever, or the denture. And that became my method, really. So the trajectory, then a couple more books. Each one took less time because I had learned more, and I was also not doing the quite so much early, first time through of the archive kind of thing. The people I was writing about afterwards were better known. So, and their papers, many of them in print in one way or another. So it was kind of easier to get through those. But I really learned on the Peabody sisters.
We are going to get back to all of that. But first, I want to ask a little bit about the practicalities of your writing. When and where do you like to write?
Well, that's kind of a trajectory question too, because it's changed so much over time. I've almost always, since my first child was born in 1984, had to fit things around whatever, the schedule of the children, or later when I was teaching, the schedule of teaching. So it's very hard for me to say that I start working in the morning and take a nap in the afternoon. and in fact, I had some wonderful mentors when I was starting out. One of them was Justin Kaplan, the great biographer of Twain and Whitman. And I knew that he was subject to some kind of skin allergy, eczema. And so he would write steadily in the morning, and then he'd have lunch, and then he'd take a nap and then do other things. And it took him about 7 years to write his books. And when I signed up to write the Peabody sisters, I thought, well, I'm not going to need that nap. I'll say it'll take me 3.5 years to do this book because I'm going to work morning and afternoon. And I had my first child by then, and there's no way I could do that. So I guess the thing that might be helpful to say is for people who are trying to fit a lot of things in at the same time, it's very hard to keep yourself from being distracted. And maybe that's the message I can give, because there was constant distraction, how to stay in the chair and keep writing. It was easy for me to stay in the chair in the archive and keep reading manuscripts, but to stay in the chair at the desk and keep writing, a trick that I had, and it might not work for everyone actually, but was I had, as a kid growing up and through college, I was a pretty serious musician, and I had been trained that, you never, if you're a concert, you never get up during, somebody's playing something. And so if I used to think I had to work in absolute silence, but I started putting on, in the case of the Peabody sisters, it was a recording of Chopin's etudes. And I just had this feeling that, once it was going, I couldn't get up. I shouldn't get up. And I would start listening. And again, maybe it's the etudes, the first one, the second one, pretty soon I was engaged in the writing. And, I'd be at the end of the CD, which luckily there's more music on a CD than an LP, So I could fall into the concentration then. And the other thing I also developed a habit was I did a lot of printing out. And this was part of the writing in waiting rooms method because I would write at my desk while my kids were at school and while I was listening to the CD and print out what I'd written. And, it might be another, and I would print out from the beginning of whatever chapter it was or the section. And then I would take that with me as I was in the waiting room or whatever it was. Or if I didn't have to go out, I'd take it down to the kitchen and read through that and make corrections and additions and that sort of thing so that when I would start in again the next day, I always had something to do. I had those corrections to make. I wasn't looking at a finished paragraph from the day before and, where am I going to go? So I think that's, for me, another great habit. And I still do that to this day. I print out a lot. I mean, I used to partly do it because computers were less reliable then and they might, collapse and you'd lose whatever you'd done. And I just wanted to be sure I hadn't lost what I'd done. But that can still happen now. But I really think, and I try to get my students to do this, that reading, if you're just reading on the screen, it's not, you kind of fool yourself into thinking something's great. And when you print it out, for me, print out and look at it, it's a whole different process. You're reading it to yourself, the way you're reading a book to yourself, and the rhythms or whatever, the clarity. There's so much that can be done that way. And then there's the kind of pleasure of, I'm fixing it. When you're starting the next day, you're happy. I'm fixing this. I'm moving forward. And then the next words come. I also walk a lot. And I often find that, sentences come to me as I'm walking, if I'm in the middle of writing, or if I get to the point where I'm about to start writing, the first sentence might come to me. And I have to get home or memorize it or something like that, get home. So walking I find really helpful.
Are you a writer who finds it important to write every day, or does it come in spurts?
I wish I could write every day. I guess to answer that, really, I rarely take a day off. But I'm not necessarily always writing. There are all sorts of other work kinds of things I have to do. When I am writing, I've lately been writing essays and shorter pieces. And when one gets going, I generally don't like to take any kind of break of a day, as once it's got going, it's in my head and I'm hearing it as I'm walking. And so I guess, I can't any longer sit for hours and hours. I have some back trouble that I may have gotten while sitting in the archive so much, that sort of thing. But so I get up. I now actually work at a standing desk and I'm talking to you now from standing up. But I get up and I go read, what I printed out at the table and that sort of thing. So it just, I need a lot of, somebody might, if they were me, if they were doing what I'm doing, they would say, oh, I have ADD, which I think is very terrible for people to sort of self-diagnose. But I think the breaking up some of the rhythm sometimes helps to, go off and do a crossword puzzle or put the laundry in the washing machine, put the laundry in the washing machine. I don't have a dishwasher. And then, it frees you up a little bit if you've written yourself into a corner.
How do you like to organize your research?
Organizing my research. Well, with the biographies, it's always, chronology is so important. You don't want the finished book to be reading sort of and then, but you need a chronological spine to follow. And so I've always, there's sort of two organizing principles. One is organized by the archive that I've been to, so that I'll have when I was working on the Peabody sisters, I would go to, there wasn't so much, or really hardly nothing you could do online. So I was going all over the country, different archives in Ohio and Virginia and blah, 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 California. And I would make notes, and bring them back. This was before there were portable computers. So it was all hard copy and typing things out. And I had a whole, lateral file, two cabinet drawers of all these letters from different archives. And I knew I didn't want to lose where they had come from. You could do this on your computer by labeling these things. I didn't want to lose track of where they'd come from. But then I realized I also needed to kind of shuffle them around the way you would, with a printed book, and you mark it up or something like that. So I made photocopies of all those, couple thousand pages of notes. And then I reorganized them chronologically, making sure that I kept track of what, archive it had come from so that I could go back and do the endnotes. But the chronological files, and for me, working from, hard copy transcripts of letters, typescripts of letters and journals, passages, I still really like it. I like to mark them up by hand. So chronology is very important, and organizing by archive so you don't lose track of where the thing has come from. And then, once you've put them all in order, there are a lot of course, when you're reading people's private letters, they don't always put dates on them, when did they write this letter? And you can start figuring out from internal evidence that they all took place at a certain time. And if you juxtapose all these letters, it's magic. Suddenly you have a story that wasn't there before. It's organizing, but it's also creating the narrative, and that's another exciting part that don't need the CD playing to keep doing it.
Where in that research process do you feel ready to start writing?
I was just thinking about this today because I'm working on a shorter essay about my family and their origins in Kansas in the 19th century in a small town in Concordia. And I had gone out there last May, and I'd been reading lots of papers, and things started proliferating. I discovered a whole branch of the family that I hadn't known about or hadn't known how to contact. And I wrote to one of them who said, just to give a kind of an example, my great grandmother I knew from the documents that my family had in 1866 attended a medical college in New York City, but we didn't know if she finished her degree. And these other people in Kansas said, when I said, "Are you related?" And they said, yes. And we have Letitia Truesdell's diploma from medical school. I thought, oh, that's great. So I write back and said, I'd love to see that diploma. And, these people weren't like me, they weren't going to scan the diploma and send it. She probably didn't even know where it was in her house. And she just said, I'd love to see you. She's in Colorado now, and then she's in Kansas. I've only been to Kansas one time in my whole life, and don't know if I'll ever go again. And I just thought, I know now that she finished the medical school, maybe, and this person isn't probably going to tell me too much more, and maybe I don't need to know much more. So maybe it's time to start thinking about writing this. So my answer to you is that, you come to a point where you think you have enough, and you know that you're going to do, some other research along the way, but suddenly you get kind of sick of turning over these stones and looking under them, and you want to say something. And I had even kind of come up, I was lucky to have a writing residency in Italy for 2 weeks in June, and I had decided I wouldn't take my computer. I would just try writing longhand, and I didn't want to be, because of my back, carrying a lot of heavy stuff around. So while there, I kind of came up with a beginning sentence. Not that I can tell you what it is now. I wrote it down, but a way into this essay. And then I came back and all this sort of stuff, and going through what I'd found in Kansas and trying to contact these people. And I thought, but now I'm like eager to go back to whatever that sentence was, with some apprehension in case it's actually no good or doesn't fit anymore. But that's a kind of mini example of it. I think for the biographies, I really did need to feel that I had gone through everything, everything that I was going to refer to, and or organize it to some extent. In the case of Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Bishop, there were many of their letters and journals were in print, so I didn't do the same thing of photocopying, but I still, their materials were more or less chronological. And when I'm writing, I guess maybe this is helpful too. I tend to always think that certain things are going to fit into a chapter, and I will in my document enter, usually a whole bunch of quotations that I think I want to get to from, that help the narrative go forward. And inevitably, I never get through all of them. But then I have this kind of store of them that I transfer to the next document for the next chapter, and I can start in again and then adding on. that's kind of fun too. You have to fool yourself into thinking you've mastered the organizational principle. This chapter is about this and it's going to end there. And that gives you the, impetus to go forward because it's all planned out. But you might get there and, well, it's not quite that, but I can see how that would start the next chapter or, something like that.
You've talked about how you like to print pages off as you go and do some work on fixing them and getting them ready before you tackle the next part. Do you have an approach to sort of larger form revision once you have a draft?
As you phrase that, it's actually not the way I work, especially the last several books. I mean, I don't have a draft and then go back. I get it right as I go along. And it was not true entirely in the case of the Peabody sisters when I didn't know what I was doing. I did in that case, and actually the first book that I wrote, same thing. I wrote a whole version of it before I had a vision of what the structure would be. And then I went back and wrote a new first chapter. And then it was, in both cases, the first two books, the non-biography and the first biography, what I ended up writing after that envisioning finally of the structure was kind of a whole new book. It wasn't like I was fixing what I'd written before. It just wasn't right. So in the case of the Peabody sisters, which is about these three women of 19th century New England, who one of them marries Nathaniel Hawthorne and one marries Horace Mann, and the third is a kind of intellectual impresario who brings all these people together, and Thoreau and Emerson and Margaret Fuller and all this stuff. Very exciting and thrilling lives. And I had, as I was working on it, had thought I'd cover their entire lives from 1803 when Elizabeth, the oldest, is born and dies in 1893, a huge thing. And I did research most of that, and then I was writing, and actually my initial idea was to start with a chapter when their mother was dying in 1853. And that's when the three sisters were kind of set up. The marriages had taken place, and the older sister was on this kind of roving residence, she called it, peddling historical texts and stuff like that, and very amusing and entertaining. And anyway, and I wrote that, and then I went back to the beginning and started writing, their childhood, and I had gotten like 450 pages, and they were still teenagers. I sent that to my editor. This must have been, at about the 15-year mark, I think. And I had by then, she was my fourth editor for all this time. The first one, who was wonderful, died, Roby Macaulay, and then the others moved on to other things. And this fourth person, she didn't even read it for about a year and a half, during which time I wasn't satisfied with it. And I had always hoped to write, I had always thought this is too big a life to do in one book. And I thought, but they wouldn't let me do 2 volumes on these obscure women. So I had this sudden vision in talking to a friend that I don't really know how, I guess I went with a friend to her, she was, Megan, we were at her mother-in-law's country house in Vermont for a weekend where she was writing intensely. And I was thinking, what am I going to do? And she said, Megan, you could quit this. You don't have to do it. People, change their minds all the time. And I thought, I cannot quit this. I'm just too deep. This is like 15 years in. And I can't let them down. And I'd had fellowships. I can't let those people down. And somehow in this moment, being away from my desk, and, this vision came to me of how I would frame it, which was to begin with the wedding of the first wedding. These 2 weddings to the interesting guys took place within a year of each other, 1842 and 1843. But I thought I'll start with the first wedding, and then we'll cut back, and then we'll end with the second wedding. And that really covered the height of the Transcendentalism movement and their involvement in it. I mean, not that it didn't go on after that, but anyway, and while I was there, I started to draft that first chapter, which suddenly had a very confident voice to it. And from then on, I was able to, basically threw out most of what I'd written before and wrote the book in, maybe 5 years' time. In the case of Margaret Fuller, I had, if you had asked me while I was working on the Peabody sisters if I would write about Margaret Fuller, I was absolutely not. She was not nice to the Peabody sisters, and too many people had written about her already. But when I finished the book and I started saying, well, these are the women of the Transcendentalist movement that people, are overshadowed by Margaret Fuller, people would say, well, who was Margaret Fuller? She'd been forgotten from the she had a peak of popularity in the 70s and early 80s. There have been a number of biographies, and scholars were working on her quite a lot between that time, but she was sort of forgotten by the public. So I had the thought of writing a short biography of Margaret Fuller. That was my plan. After having written a very big biography of the Peabody sisters, I thought, this is one person. She died at age 40 tragically in this shipwreck, and coming back from the Roman Revolution, in which she had been a foreign correspondent and ran a hospital, and she'd fallen in love and had a baby and all the stuff. They all were drowned. I thought this would make it just a great short biography and dramatic, and it was around the close to her bicentennial year, which would have been 2010. I thought, I could do that, and I signed up to do that, and of course it got bigger. But in that case, and in the case of the bishop, I had a vision of how I would structure it quite early on. And in the case of Fuller, there had been these many biographies of her, but the very first one, which is much criticized by her male friends, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Henry Channing, and James Freeman Clarke, people have criticized this for a number of reasons. One is that these people messed with the documents and, edited them and then chopped them up. So it's hard now to reproduce what they were working with. And then they also wanted to downplay and her radicalism and her scandalous love affair. So, it got a lot of criticism, but these were her closest friends, or some of her closest friends, and they had organized it in a very helpful way by the places that she had lived, for the most part. Anyway, I just thought, I'm going to take the same chapter titles and kind of an homage to them. It's not going to be the same book in any way, but that somehow was very helpful to me, connecting me with her earliest biographers, and it just seemed to make sense. And I also, I guess, very early on when I started to read, wonderfully, this fabulous editor of letters, Robert Hudspeth, who he published 6 volumes of all of Fuller's letters. And after that was done in the early 90s, I think. After that, he began publishing all of Thoreau's letters, which he just finished, and then he died recently. It's very sad, but what a life of gifts to writers and scholars. Anyway, as soon as I opened up book 1, I wasn't even in the archive, but I opened up book 1 of her letters, and the very first letter she'd written to her father when she could hardly write. I did want to go see how it looked in the handwriting, which I did. But she says, "Dear Father, it is a heavy storm. I hope you will not have to come home in it." He was off in Washington, D.C. as a congressman. And I thought, wow, this is where the book has to start. Because it foreshadows her death in a heavy storm. How could any book start any other way? And it happened that there was somebody else working on a biography at the same time, I knew. And I thought, how could anyone not use that letter? And I was so worried when his book came out a year before mine that is his going to start in the same way? But it didn't. It's, just proves the truth that everybody sees the historical record, differently, or will make a different story. But anyway, and then the Elizabeth Bishop was really an exciting formal experiment in that I had been a student of hers, so I knew I wanted to include some of my own experience with her, alternating with the biographical sections. And this book was actually originally also meant to be a short book in a series of biographies that all had the form where you'd give the author's name or the subject's name and then a quotation or something afterwards that would be illuminating. So I liked this book was called Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, which was the title of one of her 2 sestinas. She hadn't, it's another reason I thought that she didn't, only published about 100 poems in her life. I could surely do this in a short way, and it'll be somewhat personal, so it won't be like a big, biography. But I loved this sestina, and I loved the title. And then as I was looking at the sestina, I realized that the end words, this sestina is a poem of 6 stanzas with the 6 lines each, and the end words of the first stanza, the ending words of each line, are repeated as end words in the following stanzas in a specific order. And I realized that the end words were ideal for organizing her biography. So there was, I think the biography goes balcony, which is there were some key moments on balconies in her early life, and it also sort of, looking out towards the light. Balcony, crumb, coffee, river, miracle, and sun. And then my plan was to use, the way the Sestina does, use all the 6 words in its last little envoi of 3 lines or 2 lines, I guess it is. I wanted to use all the 6 words in the last sentence of the book, which I did. And so the whole thing, really, I wrote that book much faster than any of the others. It didn't turn out to be a short book because it turned out that there were a lot of new materials to work with, letters that her last lover had saved and were full of explosive things. So it became another big book, but it still had that structure and my own memoirish interludes as, it has sort of I guess you wouldn't call it quite a parallel tracks, but they were tracks that ultimately converged. My little story that kind of goes from my life growing up and meeting with hers in 1977, 76 and 7. And then she died in 79. So it was, worked really well. Very proud of that.
I guess then in some ways it makes great sense that you went from that book in which you start to incorporate some memoir to Afterlives that has often very personal essays where a lot more of you is present than in your biographies. Why did you decide to write this book at this point?
The Afterlives book came together over a number of years, and it's called Afterlives, 2 words. So that's one meaning of it. It's after I'd written these 3 big lives, Afterlives. And I also wanted to, I just began writing this in this shorter form of the essays. I guess the first one that's in the book I wrote, and it was family history. I had been aware that my father's father, this is still, again, the Kansas family, although they ended up in California, that he had, I had a lot of family letters that had come to me that I really hadn't read. I was doing my own work, but I knew that he'd been in Paris during World War I. And I think I had skimmed them enough to see that he'd found his way into the Chamber of Deputies when Clemenceau was announcing the armistice, the terms of the armistice, and it was a very moving moment. And he said, everybody cheered and cried and sang the Marseillaise, and November 11th, I guess it was, in 1918. And I was thinking about this as we were coming up to the centennial of the armistice. So I had published a few things with the New Yorker, excerpts of the Peabody sisters, and I had the ear of somebody there, and I said, how about writing about this for the centennial? And that went through, and I was really glad and interested, finding out a lot of things about my family's past that I hadn't known, and what I had thought I would find was actually very different from what I did. My grandfather had been kind of a closed down person later in life, and I knew he'd had struggled with depression through his life, and I thought I was going to find out that he had, experienced shell shock, but that wasn't what I found. I found the opposite. This was like the best time of their lives, even though it was very scary and bombs falling down and the building across the street and a lot of stress. But it was also the first year of my grandparents' marriage, and they were lucky to be able to both get to Paris before my grandfather was inducted into the AEF, so that they were living, in a pension with a view of the Eiffel Tower while all this was going on and having their first child. And it was after that things kind of got dark. But I mean, not that it was obviously not happy all the time and going to the front, whatever. Anyhow, so that was the first one. And then my own partner died shortly after that, having been unwell for quite a while. I was just derailed by that, and derailed then by the pandemic, which came so soon after. And that led to writing a couple of the other essays just as an attempt to write something at all, And I think I finally had 3 of them, and I thought, maybe this would make a book if I did a few more. And it's a very interesting grouping of essays that are some of them are family history. I guess another kind of, the second one that I wrote had to do with really about my partner, missing my partner, and the pandemic, and a period of time that I'd spent in Japan, and a hermit there who's 13th century hermit whose writing was like Thoreau. Whatever, it was a kind of a experimental meditation that actually I'm really proud of, but it also kept me going. And then after that, I recognized another important anniversary was coming up, which was my 50th high school reunion, which was also brought to mind the 50th in 2020, the 50th anniversary of the death of a classmate, Jonathan Jackson, the younger brother of a Soledad brother, George Jackson, who's had in a very unfortunate effort to do a hostage-taking plan and free his older brother who'd been in prison for 10 years on kind of ridiculous charges. Anyway, Jonathan ended up killed, and this is a famous courthouse incident in Marin County, and he was using guns that belonged to Angela Davis. It's a big, if you were around then or even not, you might know about this Marin County courthouse shooting. And so I thought I would write about that, and something I had wanted to write about for pretty much as long as I'd been a writer or journalist, but hadn't really known how to find a way into it because it really was his story. I didn't want to appropriate his story, but it was also, as I ended up writing, a kind of parallel growing up narrative of my life and his in Pasadena, which was, really an exemplar of communities that were going through, busing crises in the wake of the civil rights movement, the civil rights victories that then kind of turned into Black Power movement, all of which had their great idealistic successes, but also dramatic tragedies. So those were the three. And then I thought maybe there's some way I can keep doing this and write more about things I learned as a biographer and other meaningful experiences in my own life that kind of reverberate with larger themes about historical writing, biographical writing, a little bit like the theory behind confessional poetry that Robert Lowell originated with others like Sylvia Plath, that, your own experience is not, I'm not saying I'm so important, but what I experience is a window into the larger world of those times.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if you might be willing to read this excerpt for me from the beginning.
This is from it's not the first essay that I wrote, but in fact, it's one of the later ones, but it does have the title After Lives. And like some of the essays, it's drawing on material that I had learned, but didn't include in the books. And it also is drawing on a very unusual experience that I had that sets this off. Dead men tell no tales, but dead women do, at least to me. They speak in questions. Una Hawthorne, the eldest child of Nathaniel and Sophia Hawthorne, whose puckish disposition as a girl had been grafted by her father onto Little Pearl, Hester Prynne's willful out-of-wedlock daughter in The Scarlet Letter, was the first and most insistent. Una would not let me go. I'd given 2 decades to researching and writing a biography of the Peabody sisters, the youngest of whom was Nathaniel's wife, Sophia, a promising artist at the time of their wedding in 1842, active in her studio through their first year of marriage. That's where my book ended, with Una's birth in 1844, the year Sophia turned 35 and Nathaniel 40. By then, the Hawthornes and Sophia's 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, were well launched, along with the bold intellectual and social movement, Transcendentalism, they'd done so much to initiate. As an aspiring writer who struggled to make time for my work while raising 2 daughters, I'd been reluctant to face Sophia's renunciation of her talent in motherhood, her decision, as she once wrote to a wealthy friend who'd offered to pay for a nanny after the birth of Una's baby sister Rose, Sophia's 3rd and last child, so she might return to her easel. Painting, for the present, must go by the board, and what is more, shall go. Her children would be the best pictures I ever painted. Sophia never completed or even commenced another work of art. I should say that kind of reverberates with the last essay in the book, which is about my mother's own truncated career as an artist. Anyway, continuing with this passage. Now, on a warm evening in late June 2006, a year after my book was published, I was facing both mother and daughter in death. The Dominican Sisters of Hawthorne, New York, an order of Catholic nuns founded by Rose, who'd taken vows in midlife, had arranged for the transfer of Sophia's and Una's remains from Kensal Green Cemetery in London, where they'd been buried in 1871 and 1877, Sophia at 61, Una at 33. The two women were to be reunited with Nathaniel, as the Dominican sisters thought of it, on Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, a popular tourist site in Concord, Massachusetts, where the town's famous literary families were interred: the Emersons, Thoreaus, Alcotts, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose wife and children had died too far off to keep him company in the afterlife. We were seated on folding chairs in a small, windowless assembly room at the interior of Rosary Hill Home, the hospice for impoverished cancer patients Rose had established in 1900 and the Dominican sisters still operated, Sophia and Una's first stop on their way home to Concord. Sister Mary Joseph, the Dominican sisters' public relations officer, had invited me and a fifth-generation representative of the Hawthorne family, the poet Allison Deming, to witness the Hawthorne women's return to the United States. A plain wood casket, child-sized, Sister Mary Joseph said, lay before us on a table. She slipped out of the room, the white skirts of her habit rustling as she shut the door, telling us, "You can look inside if you'd like, but you won't find much, just bits of bone and cloth. It's been a long time, more than 120 years." Raised Unitarian in a family that prefers cremation and long-delayed celebrations of life for our dead, I'd never attended a wake or viewing, the ritual I assumed Sister Mary Joseph was permitting us to enact in private. The undeniable curiosity I felt was mixed with dread, despite the assurance there would be no skeletons. I deferred to Allison, the blood relative. She lifted the lid.
Thank you for reading so much. I enjoy your writing in these essays so much. So I'm glad to treat listeners to it a little bit.
It's also a pleasure to read and reminds me of while I was writing. I'm always reading over. And lately I've gotten more into actually reading aloud to myself sometimes if I'm particularly perplexed by what I'm trying to say. Does it make sense? So anyway, I'm used to hearing it in my head.
As a biographer, did it feel strange to write these essays with yourself as part of the narrative, or was it freeing?
Maybe a little bit of both. I think I've always felt, I think all writers write from a personal motivation to be heard. They weren't listened to when they were kids, or they experienced things that they couldn't speak of. And it's that delayed wish to tell and to be heard that motivates. And so even while I was writing about the Peabody sisters, I was, their stories reverberated with me. And that's part of what I write about in the introduction to this collection of essays. That, I don't think necessarily, I work very hard not to let my own connection with the subject affect what I'm going to present about. Inevitably, they're the things I'm interested in that maybe another person wouldn't be, such as, the first letter in the Margaret Fuller story. But I didn't pick that because I, knew somebody who drowned or anything like that. Or I had almost drowned. It's just, to me, as a writer, that was a way to start. But, I think there is an urge to tell and to bear witness, I guess. And I think that was behind the stories that are personal in my book, but they're mostly not about me. They're about people whose lives I witnessed that you might not think to know about, such as my grandfather, or whose life I didn't really know about, but can now tell about because it was representative of the kinds of lives that we're living, people who are living through just a global crisis as that war broke out. And how did they go from the kind of settled times into this just huge, worldwide calamity? And I think that's reverberates with feelings we have now. Same with the story of Jonathan Jackson. You've witnessed this wrong, in his case, the wrong done to his brother. And what is he to do? The desperation that sent him to. How are we to think about and understand that? It's very contemporary. So I think I felt comfortable doing this because I was doing it the way a biographer would. And I was in archives or in, sometimes in my case, actually, because of a move I had to make, most of the letters I was reading and working from that were family letters were actually in archives because I'd had to find a place for them. I didn't, feel safe transporting them from one place to another endlessly. So it felt in some ways the same, except of course I was discovering things about my family, and I guess I didn't put all of them in because they weren't all of interest to the reader, but they were all of interest to me.
You wrote in an essay for the New York Times last year. I'm going to quote you here. You said, "Part of the thrill in visiting the past through books comes from learning about its physical makeup, its inhabitants' customs, and ways of expressing themselves, feeling as if you are there." In this passage you just read, I think you certainly do this. You make us feel as though we're there, but it's also true in your biographies that you're not just sort of recounting to the reader, but you make us feel as if we were there in the setting and alongside the characters. What are your strategies for writing in that way?
I think it comes out of a kind of a philosophy of what biography should do, or what I want to do with biography for the reader, which is to help them feel as if they're living through life with this person and seeing life through their eyes. And it's a way of, I think, getting to essentials in my view, but also stripping away some of the, in the case of the Peabodys and Fuller and even Bishop, people could say negative things about these people, or they were, not that I'm ignoring the negative, but Fuller and some of the Peabodys really rubbed people the wrong way because they were strong women. Elizabeth Bishop was a shy person and not easily known. So if you can use their words, which luckily I had them, you know what they're saying. And in the case of the Peabodys and Fuller, writing in this period, they were writing letters and journals in a time, before Freud, where they weren't necessarily examining their thoughts for subconscious motivations. They just wanted to get it out there, their inner lives. They had this term, the innere, that they took from German, my inner self, And so there's a lot of confessional stuff and a lot of effort, very powerful effort on them, on their own part, to say really what it was they were feeling or thinking. It wasn't, when biographers get together, they talk a lot about how can you trust letters or journals? Are they presenting a self, different self to others? And, I felt very little of that from them. They were trying to get their true self out onto the page. In the case of Elizabeth Bishop, she was a closeted, well, on what term she would have used, I don't know, lesbian, loved women. And when she was writing to those women, she was being very authentic. And she was writing to friends with whom she could trust that secret. She was being very authentic. And, anyway, I was lucky to have that kind of material I could work with. One of the great finds that made my book get bigger about Bishop was a series of letters she'd written to her psychoanalyst in 1947, I think it was. So she was 36 years old. And it's as if, it's hard to know the motivation, why she wrote these letters, but it was sort of as if maybe the analyst said, you're better at writing than talking, so why don't you write out what happened, or some key moments and a little, kind of, not a little, but, a kind of psychohistory. It was just astonishing. And, she, wasn't hiding things from this. Obviously, probably she was in some way, but some of the things were just so out there that, only things she would only say to the analyst or to her closest friends. So anyway, trying to get back to answering your question, my philosophy of biography of, showing, letting the reader kind of be in the shoes of the subject and see the world through their eyes. And that, of course, brings a lot to this feeling that you are there. And I had the material to do that. And also, evoking the places. Places are extremely important. And then finding out lots that I can about, if Margaret Fuller visiting a mesmerist to deal with her pain in her shoulder because she has curvature of the spine. Well, what was mesmerism and what was that treatment exactly like? Or the same with Sophia Peabody, who had various illnesses. And luckily, my God, the physician she saw and relied on most, Dr. Walter Channing, had written a book later, later in his life called Bed Case about neurasthenic, he didn't call them. They were bed cases, women who took to their beds. And Sophia was bordering on that. At times she was a bed case. And I had not just his book about women who were experiencing that. This was before the later 19th century, rest cure stuff. This is a different view that he had very early on. But, I also had letters in which she described what kind of treatment he offered her. And I don't know, all these just miraculous things that came together, or that she was also an artist, and I knew her drawing teacher who thought a lot of her. And you'd think, well, maybe these men were kind of discouraging the women, but quite the opposite. In fact, this drawing teacher had written a novel about a woman artist. And so I was able to find this novel in the Widener Library, and just the whole picture shifts the closer you get to the books they were reading, the places they lived. It just I went to all of them in the case of Fuller and the Peabodys. I didn't quite so much in the case of Bishop, because some of the places I had been to previously myself, and then she described them. She was quite known for description, so I didn't really feel I needed to go to Brazil to describe the Brazil that she saw. But I did go to some places that she didn't describe or didn't describe at length, because she was ashamed of them. And one of them was her house where she grew up where she was living with an aunt. She was essentially an orphan and raised by aunts and uncles, and she was living with an aunt and uncle in Revere. And this is the balcony opening chapter, an abusive uncle who once hung her over the railing of a balcony by her hair. And so I went to find that place. And then I also went to the apartment house she lived in San Francisco, where after her partner Lotta had died by suicide, and she was there with a younger lover. And I don't think anyone had gone to see those places, but they meant a lot to me because they were private and places of some torment for her.
Writing biography well takes a long time. In the case of the Peabody sisters, 20 years, but your other books we're not quick turnarounds. How do you keep the faith as, life keeps continuing to happen to you, as the project is still in a very nebulous form? How do you keep going?
Well, one thing that I did as soon as I started on the Peabody sisters, I didn't know it would take me 20 years. As I said, I thought it would take me 3 years, or 3.5, half of 7, but because I wasn't going to nap. But I had had a kind of lunch group of women writers that I had been in for a while, who were novelists or poets, whatever. But I thought I wanted to start a group of women biographers that would meet regularly once a month. And I already had a friend, Susan Quinn, who'd written a biography of Karen Horney, the pioneering psychoanalyst who refuted Freud's penis envy thing. Wonderful biography. And she was working on Marie Curie. And between the two of us, we came up with, I think, 4 other people. Most of us were working on women's lives, but one person was writing about Rodin, the sculptor. Anyway, and we started meeting every month to, initially we did share our work and read to each other now and then, but over time, and this group is still meeting, it's changed the membership slightly in the early years because somebody moved away or other person finished a book. But I think we've had the same members for about 20 years now. And so 1985, this is a 40-year group. So that was really, really helpful to me, sometimes on a practical level, but also just because I had a place to go and talk about this, what I was worried would come to seem to my daughters and to my husband like an obsession that was just, they were sick of it. So I think it was a good idea, and it was very helpful. But I also think that it was kind of a woman's thing to do, to sort of hide out with my passion. Whereas I once heard about Martin Sherwin, who spent 30 years on the biography of Oppenheimer, that he ultimately joined forces with Kai Bird to publish, to get it finished. And he evidently, it was just kind of a joke in the family. He was, never going to finish it, or was in his office all the time working on this. And I don't know, if I were a guy and he was like a tenured professor at Tufts. And so it was kind of a joke. Whereas for me, this was the only thing I was doing. Was I really doing anything? It was very painful. And to me, a lot of the time, that my sense that maybe I would never finish. I really had that feeling until quite near the end, actually, because, that's the way it is. If it's not finished, it's not finished. And so the group was really very helpful. And one of the members of the group was part of a kind of collective of women in the Boston area who every May would rent a large house in Duxbury, Massachusetts on the beach and share the cost of it and use it for a kind of writer's retreat. And I went there a couple of times. Once our whole biographers group took it over for a week. And those were really important times too. So I guess looking back, I'm glad I did it. I think I would have been less furtive about it almost. Should have been. But, life teaches you a lot of lessons.
At the very start of our conversation, you mentioned being pleased to be on this podcast because of the importance of history and needing to defend it in this moment. I know you've been really involved with Biographers International and helping to promote biography as other people write it as well. How do you think about the importance of biography right now?
I think thinking about the historical profession, we've kind of emerged from a period where biography was frowned upon. You don't want to look at individual lives, privilege the individual life, and really you need to do kind of population studies and look at movements. And I think we really need exemplary lives to inspire us now. I think we always do. And regardless of the times, you might find different things in a life, depending on what urgencies are around you and that you're feeling personally. I was really, really pleased to be asked by the Smithsonian Magazine to write a short profile of Margaret Fuller for their semi-quincentennial, whatever it is, the 250th issue this summer, which was and it did come out about American innovators. And they included Margaret Fuller, they included Frederick Douglass, and Lonnie Bunch wrote this really, brave opening statement about the importance of learning all of history, everything we can find out. And I just felt so happy that we'd been talking about this piece since before the election of Trump, and they were able to hang on to this vision of what the 250th could be in their publication. So I really recommend to everyone to look at that while it's there. I don't live in DC, but there's an organization called Citizen Historians for the Smithsonian. If you live in DC, find out about them. And they are now doing some actions at the Smithsonian. As we're speaking now, it's just after that wretched statement by Trump that he wanted to put warning signs all over the place about the language in the placards. Margaret Fuller is currently featured in the National Portrait Gallery. I was so pleased to see that last summer when I was in DC, and I had to wonder, would that stay? She's in a room with Douglass and other, I forget whether they're called resistors or can that room stay? And she's, aside from that, I was so happy to see this. Her portrait, which only recently was donated to the Portrait Gallery. It had been on loan, and it's so important to me that it's there. It's the only portrait oils of her that exists from when she was in Italy. But as you're wandering about, there are various guide things on the walls in the hallway, and there's a reproduction of this portrait saying, think about portraits. What do they tell you? What mood did they convey? And they chose Margaret Fuller's. What do you think she's thinking? What can you tell about what she's wearing, about what the times are, and what do you see in the background? You see Italy. Why is that? She's an American. I'm just so happy about that, and I dread the thought that might be painted over. We don't want a revolutionary like Margaret Fuller, who said, "I'm getting towards the end of her life, which ended at age 40. I'm becoming more and more of a socialist, she writes. This is probably not something that the current administration wants featured. So anyway, I think biography is, supremely important and well told and well researched, carefully researched. We're always revising and understanding our subjects newly, and to the thought of new visions being squelched is just very, very discouraging. So go out and buy biographies, and if you're a writer, write biographies and take heart.
That's a marvelous note to end on. But I do want to know, are you working on another biography?
Well, I think I really found I like the essay form. And I do an enormous amount of research to write any of these essays. You could tell the part that I read, I was reading, I thought, whoa, I did a lot to find out just, the Rosary Hill Home and the this and the that. But I live very near Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, and I walk there a lot, and I've become fascinated with certain groups of people, not like they're not all buried in the same spot, but, different biographical narratives that I could derive from that. For example, there's an enormous obelisk marking the grave. It just says Cushman on it. Everybody would know what that was at the time when Charlotte Cushman died, but nobody knows now. Charlotte Cushman was this fabulous Shakespearean actress, American, but had a career in America and Europe, and a cross-dresser, and had a menage, more than a salon, because they were often living there in Rome, with women sculptors, and some of whom were her lovers at various times, and some of them are buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. And one of the sculptors, Edmonia Lewis, who was part of that group, a Black woman sculptor who's being revived now. There's a sculpture by her in Mount Auburn Cemetery that honors the first woman doctor in Boston, Harriet Hunt. And then, aside from that 19th century story, actually, there's another sculptor and her partner who they died in late 19th century, early 20th. They are buried together with their names on the same tomb or same stone, which was a really unusual thing to do, these two women. And in Massachusetts, you probably know that Massachusetts was the first state where same-sex marriage was legal. And there are a number of stones now. I mean, this was in 2004, I believe it was. I'd have to check that. But one member of the partner has died, of the marriage has died, one spouse, and soon both will have, I'm sure. But in the ones I've seen, just one dies, and they put up a stone or a inscription on the wall that gives the names and the date of death of the person who's died, and the date of the marriage. That's within a few days of when that ruling became official in I think it was May of 2004. I think maybe the ruling was in 2003, but it took 6 months to, be cemented, something like that. So anyway, I just find that very moving, the continuum of the history that you can find in this cemetery, which was, founded and begun in 1831, the first garden cemetery in the United States, modeled after the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. So it's a beautiful place. There's a lot to write about there. So I'm hoping to write a collection of essays, biographical for the most part, about interesting people there.
That truly sounds like a delight. So I hope you do. I can't wait to read it. Megan Marshall, what a pleasure for me. What a treat to get to talk to you about your writing process. Thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past.
Well, thank you, Kate, for such wonderful questions and close attention and the opportunity to talk about my work.
Thanks again to Megan Marshall for joining me on this episode of the Drafting the Past podcast. You can find links to her books and other things we mentioned in the show notes. If you haven't already, check out the newly redesigned draftingthepast.com. Read all about how Megan, Kate Nelson, and I are creating a space for reviews and writing dedicated to nonfiction history books. Subscribe to the newsletter while you're there so you don't miss any of the cool things that are coming. Thanks for being here and for listening. Remember that friends don't let friends write boring history.